The knife was already at my throat when I realized my own guards had stepped aside to let it happen. I did not scream. I remember that clearly, even now. My hands went cold, my breath caught somewhere behind my ribs, and the only sound in that glittering banquet hall was the soft clink of a blade catching candlelight. The attacker was fast, trained, and confident. He had every reason to be. Every guard standing near me that night belonged to houses that wanted my family gone. Every guard except one. Daniel Hart did not shout a warning. He did not draw a weapon with some dramatic flourish, the way the warriors of my world liked to do, spinning their blades so everyone could admire the shine of the metal before the fight even began. He simply moved. One moment, he was standing quietly by the pillar where I had told him to wait, looking, as always, faintly bored. The next moment the attacker was on the floor, disarmed, pinned, and confused, and Daniel was crouched beside me asking, in a calm and ordinary voice, if I was hurt. I was not hurt. I was stunned. The whole hall stared. Nobody clapped. Nobody praised him. In my world, when a warrior saves someone, the room erupts into approval, into songs, into declarations of honor. That night there was only silence, and then, from somewhere near the high table, laughter. Cruel, careless laughter, from Lord Gareth Combe, a rival of my family who had spent the last 3 years trying to see me removed from my seat of influence. "A human," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, moving like a startled animal. How undignified. I suppose even luck has to land somewhere. I should explain who I am, and why any of this matters. My name is Celine Marlowe. I belong to one of the oldest ruling families of the Ashen Court, a coalition of powerful worlds that governs trade, law, and war across a vast stretch of the galaxy. My people are strong. We are tall, we are long-lived, we train from childhood in combat and diplomacy, and we take enormous pride in our warriors, who are chosen for their strength, their reflexes, and their fierce, undeniable presence. A guard from a noble house is supposed to look like a mountain given legs. He is supposed to be feared before he even lifts a hand. Humans are not feared. Humans are pitied. Across the galaxy, humanity is known as a young, fragile species. They live short lives. Their bodies break easily compared to ours. They lack the raw strength of a Virun warrior, the natural armor of a Threll soldier, or the enhanced reflexes bred into the guard clans of Kes Prime. Most humans working among the stars are found doing quiet, unglamorous labor, hauling cargo, maintaining machinery, staffing kitchens. Nobody hires a human to protect their life. Nobody except, apparently, my father. 3 months before that banquet, my father had been given an assignment on the border station of Calyx Reach, a place known for old grudges and new dangers, a meeting point between 3 warring trade families and countless smaller enemies who wanted a piece of what we controlled. My father, in his usual habit of testing me before he was ready to let me lead, had sent me in his place, and to protect me, he had assigned me a single guard, a human. I remember reading the file on Daniel Hart the night before I left. It told me almost nothing useful, no family of note, no decorated service record filled with famous victories, a quiet record of contract work, security postings, and a strange gap in his history that nobody had bothered to explain. When I asked my father why he would send me somewhere dangerous with someone so unremarkable, he only said one sentence that I dismissed at the time as an old man's stubbornness. You judge a blade by watching it cut, not by how loudly it announces itself. I did not understand what that meant, not yet. When I met Daniel for the first time, on the docking platform of Calyx Reach, I expected either arrogance or fear. Humans I had met before tended toward one or the other around my people, either overly eager to prove themselves or quietly nervous in the presence of species so much larger and stronger than themselves. Daniel was neither. He looked at me, gave a short nod, picked up my luggage without being asked, and said only, "I've studied the station layout. We should move through the east corridor, not the main hall. Fewer angles for someone to watch us." I laughed, right there on the platform, in front of my own staff. I could not help it. It sounded so unnecessary, so paranoid, coming from someone so plain-looking, dressed in simple dark clothing, with no visible weapon, no armor, nothing that announced power the way my people expected a protector to announce power. "I think the main hall will be fine," I told him, already walking toward it. He did not argue. He simply followed, silent, watching everything, while I ignored him completely. That first week set the tone for everything after. My staff mocked him openly, calling him the shadow or the quiet pet, jokes he never seemed to react to. Other guards assigned to nearby dignitaries would challenge him to friendly sparring matches meant to humiliate him in front of an audience, and Daniel always declined, calmly, without explanation, which only made people laugh harder and call him a coward. I began to believe them. It was easy to believe. Every day I watched real warriors around the station display their strength constantly, testing blades, showing off armor, growling threats at rivals, simply to establish dominance, the way our culture demanded. Daniel did none of that. He ate quietly, slept very little, and spent an unusual amount of time simply walking the corridors of wherever we were staying, memorizing exits, counting guards, watching people's hands more than their faces. I once asked him why he never rested properly. "Rest happens when the job is done," he said, "not before." I remember rolling my eyes at that. It sounded like something a soldier would say to sound important, not like something a genuinely capable person would need to say. The rearranging of my patrols was what irritated me the most. Daniel insisted on changing the routes my other guards walked, insisted certain doors remain locked that had never been locked before, insisted I avoid specific balconies at specific times of day for reasons he refused to fully explain. My own household staff complained to me constantly. They said he was overstepping his role. They said a proper guard trusted the strength of his body, not a maze of unnecessary precautions. I nearly dismissed him twice in that first month. Twice I called him into my chambers to tell him his services were no longer needed, and twice something in his calm, steady expression made me hesitate, made me tell myself I would give him one more week. Looking back now, I think some quiet part of me had already noticed something the rest of the court had not. I noticed that despite being mocked constantly, despite being challenged and dismissed, and laughed at in every hallway we walked, Daniel never once looked afraid. Not of the warriors twice his size, not of the political enemies who wanted my family removed from power, not of me, even when I spoke to him with the same casual disrespect everyone else did. He simply watched, always watching, always calculating, like a man reading a language only he understood. The night of the banquet was supposed to be simple, a gathering of trade families, a show of unity meant to calm tensions after a string of small conflicts along the border. I wore the formal colors of my house. My guards, all except Daniel, wore polished armor meant to intimidate. Daniel wore the same plain dark clothing he always wore, standing quietly near the pillar closest to my seat, exactly where he had insisted on standing, despite my steward telling him 3 other spots offered better visibility for the room. I did not know, until much later, that Daniel had spent 2 days quietly observing the serving staff, noting who avoided eye contact, who lingered too long near certain exits, who carried themselves with a stillness that did not match a life of simple kitchen work. I did not know that the man who attacked me that night had been hired weeks earlier by a rival house, desperate to see my family's influence collapse before it could grow further. I only knew, in the moment the blade touched my throat, that I was certain I was about to die, and that the guards, standing closest to me, the ones with the polished armor and the impressive war records, had done absolutely nothing to stop it. And then, faster than I could process, it was over. The blade was gone. The attacker was on the ground, pinned beneath a man everyone in that room had spent months laughing at. Lord Gareth Combs' laughter still echoes in my memory from that night, sharp and mocking, dismissing what had just happened as nothing more than a lucky accident. Around him, other nobles nodded in agreement, already constructing a version of events where Daniel's actions meant nothing at all, where the true danger had simply been clumsy, where my family's choice of guard remained something to be pitied rather than respected. I sat there, shaking slightly, staring at the man who had just saved my life, and I felt something uncomfortable settle in my chest. Not gratitude, not yet. Something closer to confusion, and beneath that, the first faint stirring of doubt about everything I thought I understood. Daniel helped me to my feet without a word, checked the restrained attacker one more time, and then looked toward the guards who should have acted and hadn't. He said nothing to them either. He simply turned back to me and asked if I wished to return to my quarters. I nodded, still unable to speak properly, and as we walked out of that hall together, past the whispers and the laughter and the pitying glances of an entire court that still believed humans were beneath them, I remember thinking one thought clearly for the first time. They were wrong about him. I did not yet understand how wrong. The days after the banquet should have changed things. They did not. Not in the way I expected. I had imagined, foolishly, that saving my life in front of half the court would earn Daniel some measure of respect, even a small one. Instead, the opposite happened. Within a day, the story of what happened had already been reshaped by people who had not even been in the room. By the time it reached the outer trade halls of Calyx Reach, the tale had become one of a lucky stumble, a clumsy assassin who tripped over his own blade, and a human who happened to be standing nearby at the right moment. Lord Gareth Combe made sure of that. He was clever in the way that dangerous men often are, never lying outright, simply shaping small truths until they formed a picture he wanted others to see. He mentioned, in passing, at every gathering he attended, how strange it was that a trained assassin could be stopped by someone with no visible weapon and no formal combat title. He wondered aloud, always with a polite smile, whether the entire event had been staged, perhaps to make my family look strong, when in truth we were surrounded by weakness. I hated how effective it was. I hated it more because some small, stubborn part of me still half believed it too. Daniel never once tried to defend himself. When my steward asked him directly, in front of other staff, how he had reacted so quickly that night, he only said, "I was paying attention," and left it at that. No boasting, no detailed account of his training, no attempt to correct the rumors spreading through the station. It frustrated me in a way I did not fully understand at the time. If someone questioned my honor, I would have answered loudly, decisively, in front of as many witnesses as possible. Daniel simply let the words pass over him like wind against stone. I began watching him more closely after that, though I told myself it was only out of professional caution, nothing more. What I noticed unsettled me in a quiet way I could not easily explain to anyone else. Daniel woke earlier than any of my other guards, often before the station's artificial dawn cycle even began. He spent that early time in careful, repetitive motion, the same simple movements performed slowly, over and over, until they looked less like exercise and more like some kind of meditation. When I asked him what he was doing, he told me he was keeping his body ready, in case readiness was needed suddenly and without warning. I asked him why he didn't train the way our warriors trained, with heavy weights and loud displays of strength meant to intimidate onlookers. "Strength that only exists to be seen isn't strength," he said. "It's decoration." I did not have a response to that. I still do not, fully, even now. He ate very little, and always the same simple rations, regardless of the extravagant meals offered to guards of noble houses on Calyx Reach. When I asked why he refused the finer food available to him, he said heavy meals slowed reaction time, and reaction time, in his line of work, was often the only thing standing between someone living and someone dying. It sounded almost absurd to me at first, this idea that a guard would deny himself comfort simply to remain slightly faster in a crisis that might never come. Slowly, though, I began to notice that Daniel behaved every single day as if that crisis were only moments away, as if the banquet attack had not been an unusual event, but a preview of something larger still waiting to happen. He continued rearranging my patrols despite the constant complaints from my household staff. He insisted certain hallways be avoided during specific hours, times when he said the lighting created blind spots, too easily exploited by someone waiting in ambush. He insisted on personally checking the mechanisms of every door leading to my private chambers, running his fingers along hinges and locks with a patience that seemed excessive to guards who simply trusted the strength of their own bodies to handle any threat that arose. My other guards resented him deeply for this. There was one in particular, a broad-shouldered warrior of the Threll people named Boran Vask, who made it his personal mission to humiliate Daniel whenever possible. Boran stood nearly twice Daniel's height, with thick natural plating along his forearms that made most conventional blades useless against him. He often challenged Daniel to sparring matches in front of the other staff, loudly questioning why a human, so small and so fragile by comparison, had been given a position of protection that should have belonged to someone with real physical presence. Daniel always declined these challenges calmly, which only made Boran push harder, calling him a coward in increasingly public settings, until finally, one afternoon in the station's shared training hall, Daniel accepted. I was not present for the beginning of that exchange, only arriving partway through after hearing about it from a nervous member of my staff who rushed to find me, certain that Daniel was about to be seriously hurt in front of an audience that would delight in the sight. By the time I arrived, it was already over. Boran was sitting on the floor of the training hall, breathing heavily, his pride clearly more damaged than his body. Daniel stood a short distance away, not even breathing hard, his expression as calm as it always was. The small crowd that had gathered to watch Daniel's expected humiliation stood in stunned silence instead. Later, I learned what had happened, pieced together from several accounts that all agreed on the essential details, though each witness seemed almost embarrassed to admit what they had seen. Boran had charged forward with the raw strength that had won him dozens of sparring matches against warriors of every species stationed at Calyx's reach. Daniel had not tried to match that strength directly. He had simply stepped aside, redirected Boran's own momentum against him, and ended the match in a matter of seconds, using controlled, precise movement rather than force. There had been no dramatic display, no roar of victory, nothing that matched the expectations of an audience raised on warriors who celebrated their strength loudly and publicly. Because there had been no spectacle, most of the onlookers convinced themselves that nothing important had happened at all. Somehow, even after watching Daniel defeat one of the most physically dominant guards on the station, the story that spread afterward painted it as luck again, or worse, as some kind of unfair trick unworthy of true combat. I found this reaction almost as strange as Daniel's calmness itself. It was as if my entire culture had built such a rigid idea of what strength was supposed to look like that they could not recognize it when it appeared in a different shape entirely. I asked Daniel about it that evening, sitting across from him in the small quarters attached to my chambers, a conversation that felt different from the countless orders and instructions I usually gave him. "Doesn't it bother you," I asked, "being dismissed like that, even after you clearly won?" He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Where I come from," he said, "the ones who survive longest are rarely the loudest. Humans learned a long time ago that being underestimated keeps you alive longer than being feared. If people believe you're weak, they stop watching you carefully. That mistake has saved more lives than any show of strength ever could." I remember staring at him, trying to understand whether he was simply justifying his own quiet nature or describing something deeper about an entire species I had never truly bothered to understand. "Your people have fought wars," I said carefully, "real wars, difficult ones, before you ever reached the stars. More than most species realize," he said. "We didn't survive them by being the strongest creatures on our world. We survived by adapting faster than anything else could, by finding solutions instead of relying on size or claws or natural weapons. It's not a glamorous history. It's not one we tell with pride, the way your people tell stories of great warriors. but it's why humans are still here at all." It was the most Daniel had ever said to me at once, and something about the quiet weight of his words settled uncomfortably in my chest, forcing me to reconsider assumptions I had never questioned before. Word of Boren's defeat eventually reached Lord Gareth Combe, as I suspected it would. Rather than weakening his mockery, it seemed to sharpen it instead. At the next gathering of trade families, he made a point of bringing up the sparring match directly, framing it not as a display of skill, but as proof that humans fought dishonorably, avoiding true combat through trickery rather than facing an opponent's strength directly. "A real warrior meets force with force," he said, loud enough for the surrounding nobles to hear clearly. "There is no honor in dodging and slipping like some frightened animal. Perhaps this is simply the human way, unable to stand and fight properly, forced instead to rely on clever little tricks." Several nobles murmured in agreement. I remember feeling anger rise in my chest, sharper than before, though I still could not fully explain why the mockery of my own guard affected me so deeply. Perhaps it was simply pride in my family's choices being questioned. Perhaps it was something else beginning to form, something closer to a genuine, growing respect I did not yet want to admit to myself. Pressure began building from multiple directions after that. Members of my own household suggested, carefully at first, then more directly, that I replace Daniel with a guard more suited to the expectations of Calyx's reach, someone whose physical presence alone might discourage future attacks rather than relying on unpredictable methods that continued to invite ridicule from rival houses. My father sent a brief message asking only whether I remained confident in my current arrangement, a question I suspected carried more weight than its simple wording suggested. I found myself standing at a strange crossroads. Every instinct trained into me by my culture told me that Daniel's continued presence as my guard only invited further embarrassment, further doubt about my judgment as a leader among my people. And yet, every time I thought seriously about dismissing him, I remembered the calm certainty in his eyes the night of the banquet, the quiet ease with which he had ended Boren's challenge without a single wasted motion, the strange, unglamorous history he had described to me about a species that survived not through strength, but through something far harder to see and far harder to dismiss once you finally noticed it. It was during this uncertain period, while I still wrestled with doubts I refused to speak aloud, that the first quiet warning arrived, carried through station channels usually reserved for matters far more serious than court gossip and social rivalry. A private message reached my steward late one evening, marked with a level of security clearance rarely used outside matters of genuine danger. It contained only a short warning, sourced from contacts within the trade family's monitoring movement through the border sectors surrounding Calyx's reach. A group known only through fragments of rumor and old, unconfirmed reports had been active recently in the region, a group whose reputation, when mentioned at all, tended to silence even the most confident warriors in the room. They were called, simply, the Kestrel Circle, and unlike the desperate lone attacker from the banquet, they did not fail. I did not understand yet how close that warning would soon become. I only understood, staring at the message in my trembling hands, that whatever quiet doubts I still carried about Daniel Hart were about to be tested in a way none of us were fully prepared for. The name Kestrel Circle meant little to me at first. Only a string of syllables attached to a warning I assumed was routine caution from an overly careful intelligence network. It was my steward, a nervous but well-informed man named Edwin Voss, who explained to me exactly why the mention of that name had drained the color from the faces of my most senior advisors. The Kestrel Circle was not a gang of desperate criminals looking for easy coin. They were something far more dangerous, a small, disciplined group of professional operatives who accepted contracts only from clients wealthy enough to afford their impossible fees, and only for targets important enough to justify the risk. Their reputation had been built over decades, quietly, through a long list of successful contracts that rarely made it into public record, since the families who hired them preferred silence to scrutiny. What made them truly feared, Edwin explained, was not simply their skill, but their discipline. They studied their targets for weeks, sometimes months, before ever making a move. They avoided unnecessary risk. They planned every operation with a level of patience that most warriors, trained to value bold, immediate action, found almost insulting. And once they accepted a contract, they had never, in the entire history anyone could trace, failed to complete it. I remember asking Edwin a question that felt foolish even as I spoke it. If they never fail, I said, then why would anyone bother resisting them at all? He did not have a comforting answer. Word spread quickly through the station, once the warning became known among the senior households, and true to the nature of Calic's reach, the danger somehow transformed, within a single day, into another opportunity for court gossip rather than genuine alarm. Nobles who should have been focused on security instead used the rumor as another excuse to question my judgment, framing the potential threat as further proof that my household's protection, led by an unremarkable human guard, was simply not prepared for a challenge of this magnitude. Lord Gareth Combe, predictably, made the most of it. He requested a private audience with me 2 days after the warning arrived, a request I nearly declined out of simple exhaustion, before deciding it would be wiser to hear whatever manipulation he intended to attempt directly, rather than through the distorted whispers of court gossip. He arrived in my receiving chamber, dressed in formal colors, flanked by 2 of his own guards, both towering warriors of his house, whose presence alone was meant to remind me of exactly the kind of protection he believed I lacked. "Lady Marlowe," he began, his tone carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of sounding helpful while working against your interests. "I've come only out of concern for your safety. Surely you understand the seriousness of this warning." "I understand it well enough," I told him. "Then surely," he continued, "you understand why continuing to rely on a single, unproven guard, however lucky he may have been on one occasion, would be an unacceptable risk for someone of your position. The Kestrel Circle does not send clumsy attackers who trip over their own weapons. They send professionals who succeed quietly, efficiently, without any of the drama that allowed your human to appear competent by accident." I felt anger rising again, sharper this time, though I forced my expression to remain composed. "And what would you suggest instead?" I asked. He smiled, clearly pleased that I had asked the question he wanted. "My house would be honored to provide additional protection for the upcoming trade summit," he said. "Warriors trained specifically to counter operatives of this caliber. It would, of course, require your household to acknowledge publicly that additional support was necessary, a small formality, easily arranged." I understood immediately what he truly wanted. Not simply my safety, but my public admission of weakness, an admission that would weaken my family's standing among the trade houses far more effectively than any assassin ever could. Accepting his help would mean placing armed strangers loyal to a rival house directly inside my own security, a vulnerability disguised as generosity. I declined his offer as politely as I could manage, though I suspected he saw through my composure easily enough. He left with the same practiced smile, promising only that he hoped I would reconsider before the summit, when it might already be too late. That evening, I found myself standing in the small training space adjoining my quarters, watching Daniel move through his slow, repetitive exercises in the low evening light of the station's artificial dusk cycle. I had come intending simply to inform him of Gareth's visit, but instead found myself lingering, watching the quiet precision of his movements longer than necessary. "You heard about the summit," I said finally. He did not stop his exercises immediately, finishing the motion before turning to face me fully. "I did," he said. "And about Lord Combe's offer. Word travels fast on this station," I muttered. "Word always travels fast when someone wants you to feel afraid enough to accept help you don't actually need," he said. I studied him carefully. "Do you think his warriors would actually help?" I asked. "If the Kestrel Circle really is as dangerous as everyone claims?" Daniel considered the question seriously, without the dismissiveness I half expected. More warriors doesn't always mean more safety, he said. Sometimes it means more confusion, more people to coordinate, more opportunities for someone to exploit gaps between different groups who don't trust each other and don't share the same instincts. The Kestrel Circle wouldn't need to fight through numbers. They'd exploit exactly that kind of disorganization. And you think you can protect me better alone than an entire additional detail could? I asked, unable to keep a trace of skepticism from my voice. I think, he said, choosing his words with unusual care, that the Kestrel Circle has almost certainly already studied every guard on this station, including Lord Combs' warriors, including your own household staff. Adding more predictable warriors to your protection only gives them more familiar patterns to plan around. What they haven't studied properly, what they can't easily predict, is someone who doesn't fight the way they expect a guard to fight. I sat down slowly across from him, the weight of the situation finally beginning to settle fully into my chest. Tell me honestly, I said. Have you ever faced people like this before? He was quiet for a long moment, longer than usual, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different quality than I had heard from him before, something quieter, more distant, as though reaching back through memory to a place he did not often revisit. Where I trained, he said, before I ever left my own world, there were people like the Kestrel Circle among humans too, groups who made violence into a discipline, who valued patience and precision over spectacle. I learned early that the ones who survived encounters with people like that weren't the strongest fighters in the room. They were the ones who understood something the attackers didn't expect them to understand. What's that? I asked quietly. That real danger doesn't announce itself, he said. It doesn't posture, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't waste time trying to look impressive. The most dangerous people I've ever known were often the quietest in the room, right up until the moment it mattered. I thought of every warrior I had ever admired growing up, every loud display of strength I had been taught to associate with true protection. Every moment I had judged Daniel harshly, simply because he refused to perform the way my culture expected protectors to perform. Something uncomfortable twisted in my chest, a slow, dawning realization that perhaps I had been measuring him against entirely the wrong standard from the very beginning. I want you to tell me something honestly, I said. If the Kestrel Circle really comes for me, do you believe you can stop them? He met my eyes directly, without hesitation, without the false confidence I had seen in countless warriors trying to reassure a nervous employer. I believe I can give you a better chance than anyone else on this station, he said. I won't promise certainty. Anyone who promises certainty against people like this is lying to make you feel better, not telling you the truth. Strangely, his honesty reassured me more than any confident promise could have. I realized, sitting there in the quiet evening light, that this was perhaps the first time since arriving at Calyx Reach that I had felt something close to genuine trust toward the man everyone else in my life continued to dismiss. The following days passed in a tense blur of preparation. Daniel spent long hours studying the layout of the summit hall where the trade families would gather, memorizing entrances, exits, sightlines, and the countless small details that most guards never bothered to consider. He requested access to the station's security archives, reviewing footage from previous gatherings, noting patterns in how staff moved through the space, which doors remained unmonitored during specific hours, which areas offered concealment for anyone waiting to strike without warning. My household staff continued their quiet resentment, though the mood among them had shifted slightly since Boren's defeat, an uneasy mixture of lingering doubt and something that might, in time, have grown into respect had circumstances allowed it to develop naturally. Boren himself, to my surprise, had stopped mocking Daniel entirely, instead watching him now with a careful, evaluating expression that suggested he, at least, had begun to understand something the rest of the court still refused to see. 3 days before the summit, Edwin brought me confirmation that solidified every fear I had been trying to manage since the first warning arrived. Through careful, quiet channels within the trade network, our intelligence contacts had confirmed that a formal contract had indeed been placed with the Kestrel Circle, timed specifically for the summit, when security across the entire station would be stretched thin, managing the arrival of every major trade family at once. The client behind the contract remained unknown, though I harbored little doubt about who benefited most from my family's removal from power at precisely this moment. I remember standing alone in my chambers that night, staring out at the distant stars beyond the station's viewport, feeling for the first time the true, cold weight of what awaited me. Every mocking laugh Gareth Combe had ever directed at Daniel echoed through my memory. Every dismissive comment from nobles who judged strength only by how loudly it announced itself. Every moment I myself had doubted the quiet, careful man who had already saved my life once without asking for a single word of thanks. Daniel found me there some time later, standing quietly in the doorway before speaking. "Whatever happens at the summit," he said, "I need you to trust the instructions I give you, exactly, without hesitation, even if they seem strange in the moment." I turned to face him, studying the calm certainty in his expression, the same stillness that had unsettled me when we first met, and now, somehow, felt like the only steady ground remaining beneath my feet. "I trust you," I said, and found, to my own quiet surprise, that I meant it completely. He nodded once, already turning his attention back to the security layouts spread across the table behind him, already planning for a confrontation that would test everything he had spent his entire life preparing for, while the rest of the station continued to believe, right up until the very last moment, that he was the weakest thing standing between me and the deadly, patient professionals now closing in from beyond the border. The summit hall was filled with more light and more noise than I had ever seen it hold before. Every trade family arriving in full formal dress, their guards lining the walls in polished armor meant to project unity and strength to rivals watching from every corner of the room. I sat near the center of the gathering, exactly where protocol demanded, exactly where anyone planning an attack would expect to find me. Daniel stood a short distance behind my seat, not in the position my household staff had originally assigned him, but in a spot he had quietly chosen himself 2 days earlier, a position that gave him a clear line of sight to 3 of the 4 main entrances while keeping his own presence unremarkable among the general movement of staff and attendants. I tried to appear calm as the ceremony began, the formal greetings between trade families stretching on with the same tedious ritual I had witnessed dozens of times before. Lord Gareth Combe sat not far from me, offering a polite nod that carried no warmth behind it, his own guards positioned prominently around his seat, a visible display of strength meant to remind everyone present exactly whose protection looked more capable on the surface. I do not know exactly when the attack began, only that one moment the hall was filled with the low murmur of formal conversation, and the next, the lights along the eastern wall flickered and died, plunging an entire section of the room into sudden darkness. Screaming erupted almost immediately, confused and scattered, as attendants and guards alike struggled to understand what was happening. I felt Daniel's hand on my shoulder before I even fully processed the danger, pulling me down and to the side, away from my seat, just as something struck the exact spot where I had been sitting moments before. "Move when I move," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the panic spreading through the rest of the hall. "Stay low, stay behind me, and don't stop unless I tell you to." I did not argue. I simply followed, my heart pounding, as Daniel guided me away from the center of the chaos, moving with a calm precision that felt almost unnatural against the screaming confusion surrounding us. Around us, the summit dissolved into disorder. Guards from various households reacted in different ways, some drawing weapons and shouting commands that went unheeded in the darkness, others freezing entirely, uncertain how to respond to an attack unlike anything most of them had trained for. I caught glimpses, through the flickering emergency lighting that had begun activating along the walls, of figures moving through the crowd with a deliberate, coordinated efficiency that marked them clearly as professionals rather than the desperate lone attacker from the banquet months earlier. There were at least 4 of them, moving in careful, practiced formation, using the confusion of the crowd as cover while they advanced steadily toward my position. Unlike the guards around me, they did not shout, did not posture, did not waste a single motion on anything beyond the exact task in front of them. Boran Vask, to his credit, attempted to intercept one of them directly, charging forward with the same raw strength that had won him countless sparring matches. The attacker simply avoided his charge with minimal movement, redirecting Boran's own momentum into a nearby pillar with a controlled ease that left the massive warrior stunned on the ground, out of the fight before it had truly begun for him. Daniel pulled me behind an overturned banquet table, positioning himself between me and the approaching threat, his eyes scanning the chaos with the same careful focus I had seen him apply to empty hallways and quiet corridors during the weeks before this moment. Except now, that same focus carried an intensity that sent a cold shiver through me. "Stay here," he said. "Do not move from this spot no matter what you hear." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him this was too dangerous, that he should wait for additional support, but the words caught in my throat as I watched him move away from me, toward the approaching figures, without a single trace of hesitation. What followed remains, even now, difficult for me to fully describe with the clarity I wish I possessed. I caught fragments, glimpses through the chaos and flickering light, moments that felt disconnected from each other, yet built toward something I slowly realized I was witnessing for the first time in its true form. Daniel did not meet the attackers with force the way Boran had attempted. He used the darkness itself as a tool, moving along paths he had clearly memorized during his countless quiet walks through this very hall, appearing and disappearing between pillars and overturned furniture in ways that seemed to confuse the attacker's careful formation almost immediately. One of them turned to face him directly, weapon raised with the same disciplined precision I imagined had ended countless lives before this moment. Daniel closed the distance faster than seemed possible, redirecting the strike with minimal motion, disarming the attacker with a controlled efficiency that left the weapon skittering harmlessly across the floor before the attacker himself was subdued and unable to continue. A second attacker moved to support the first, and Daniel adjusted instantly, using the confusion of the darkened hall to separate them further, exploiting exactly the blind spots he had spent weeks quietly mapping, while everyone around him assumed he was simply being unnecessarily cautious. I watched Lord Gareth Combs' own warriors, positioned prominently throughout the hall, struggle to organize any coherent response, their strength and polished armor meaning little against attackers who refused to engage them directly, slipping instead, through the chaos, toward targets who mattered more to their contract. It was the third attacker, I later learned, who first hesitated. I did not understand at the time why the pattern of the fight seemed to shift, why the remaining 2 attackers began moving with less certainty than they had shown at the beginning. It was only afterward, piecing together accounts from several witnesses along with what Daniel eventually explained to me, that I began to understand what had actually happened in those critical moments. Professionals like the Kestrel Circle did not simply rely on skill alone. They relied on reading their opponents accurately, recognizing patterns of training, predicting responses based on years of experience, studying how different species, different cultures, different guards typically reacted under pressure. It was this exact skill, the ability to read an opponent's capability almost instantly, that began working against them the moment they truly focused their attention on Daniel. They had prepared, I later understood, for guards trained in the traditional styles common across the trade families, warriors who relied on strength, who telegraphed their movements through years of habit built around impressing onlookers rather than pure efficiency. What they encountered instead moved without any of those familiar patterns, adapting instantly to counter their formation, exploiting weaknesses in their approach that a lifetime of successful contracts had never forced them to consider. The third attacker, according to witnesses positioned closer to that section of the hall, froze mid-motion after a brief, silent exchange with Daniel that lasted only a few seconds, an exchange that involved no words at all, only the recognition in his stance, in the particular economy of his movement, of exactly what kind of danger he actually represented. I did not fully understand what I was witnessing until the fourth attacker, the one who had originally led their coordinated advance toward my position, suddenly called out something short and sharp in a language I did not recognize, a command that caused the remaining attackers to disengage almost instantly. I watched, stunned, as the professionals who had approached with such disciplined confidence only minutes earlier turned away from the fight entirely, retreating through the chaos toward the same darkened section of the hall from which they had first emerged, abandoning a contract that, according to every account I had heard about the Kestrel Circle, they had never before failed to complete. The emergency lighting finally stabilized moments later, revealing the true scale of the disorder that had consumed the summit hall. Overturned tables, scattered attendants, guards from various households finally beginning to organize a response that had come far too late to matter. Boran Vask struggled upright near the pillar where he had been stunned, disoriented but largely unharmed. Lord Gareth Combs' warriors stood near his position, tense and confused, having contributed nothing meaningful to the outcome despite their imposing presence throughout the evening. Daniel found me exactly where he had left me, checking quickly to ensure I remained unharmed before scanning the hall once more, still alert despite the retreat of the attackers, still cataloging exits and movement even as the immediate danger passed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness it always did, though I noticed now, for the first time, a faint trace of exhaustion beneath it. I shook my head, still struggling to process what I had just witnessed. "They ran," I said quietly. "The Kestrel Circle actually ran." Daniel did not answer immediately, his eyes still moving carefully across the hall, still watching for any sign that the retreat might simply be a temporary repositioning rather than a genuine withdrawal. When he finally spoke, his words carried a quiet weight that settled deep into my chest. "They ran because they recognized something they weren't prepared to fight," he said. "Professionals like that don't take unnecessary risks. When the cost of continuing outweighs the value of the contract, they disengage. It's not fear the way your culture understands fear. It's discipline." I stared at him, still trying to reconcile the calm, unremarkable man everyone around me had spent months mocking with what I had just witnessed him accomplish against opponents whose reputation had silenced even the most confident warriors on this station. Around us, the summit hall slowly began returning to some semblance of order, attendants and staff emerging from hiding places, guards finally organizing patrols that should have been active from the very beginning of the attack. Lord Gareth Combe approached slowly, his expression carrying none of the confident mockery I had grown accustomed to seeing whenever he addressed my household. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, directed not at me, but at Daniel himself. Daniel met his gaze evenly, without a trace of triumph or satisfaction in his expression. "Someone decided the risk wasn't worth the reward," he said simply, before turning his attention back to me, already beginning to plan the safest route back to my quarters, already moving forward into whatever came next, while the entire hall stood in stunned silence around him, finally beginning to understand exactly what they had spent months failing to see. The days following the summit felt strange in a way I struggled to describe, even to myself. The station that had spent months treating Daniel as a source of quiet amusement now seemed uncertain how to speak of him at all. Conversations that once carried easy mockery grew careful, hesitant, filled with pauses that told me more than words ever could. Edwin came to me 2 days after the attack, with a report compiled from every witness account his office had gathered, along with fragments of intelligence pulled from contacts across the border trade networks. The picture that emerged from those fragments confirmed something I had already begun to suspect, though hearing it laid out so plainly still left me sitting in silence for a long moment after he finished speaking. The Kestrel Circle, according to every source Edwin could locate, had never before withdrawn from a contract once an attack had already begun. Their reputation across the trade sectors had been built on absolute completion, a record so consistent that several older trade families had quietly used the mere mention of their name as a warning meant to discourage rivals from testing their patience. What had happened during the summit represented something entirely without precedent in their known history, and the trade networks, ever hungry for information, had already begun circulating quiet, careful questions about exactly what had caused such an unusual and unexpected retreat. I asked Edwin whether anyone had identified who Daniel truly was, whether some hidden history explained the calm, controlled skill I had witnessed during the attack. Edwin admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that despite considerable effort, his intelligence contacts had found remarkably little beyond what I already knew, a gap in his service record that seemed less like an oversight and more like the deliberate result of very careful, very deliberate discretion. I decided, finally, to ask Daniel directly, choosing an evening when the station's corridors had grown quiet, when the two of us sat together in the small space that had slowly become less a guard's post and more something closer to genuine companionship. "Who were you?" I asked, "before you came to serve my family? What did you do that taught you to fight the way you fought that night?" Daniel considered the question for a long time before answering, longer than he usually took to respond to anything I asked him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet weight I had not heard from him before, something closer to memory than explanation. "Humanity has always been underestimated," he said, "not just by other species out among the stars, but by itself, throughout its own history. We are not the strongest creatures our world ever produced. We were never the fastest, never the ones with natural armor or claws or venom. What we had instead was the ability to adapt faster than anything that threatened us, to solve problems creatively when brute strength alone would have failed. Long before humans ever left our own world, we learned this lesson through countless smaller struggles most people never think to study anymore. I trained, before I ever came here, in traditions built from that history, methods developed by people who understood that surviving real danger rarely looked like the stories told afterward. It isn't loud, it isn't glorious, it's controlled, patient, and often invisible until the exact moment it needs to be seen. I sat with his words for a long moment, turning them over against everything I had believed about strength since childhood, every lesson my own culture had taught me about what a warrior was supposed to look like, supposed to sound like, supposed to demonstrate constantly in order to be respected. "Why did you never explain this to anyone?" I asked. "Why let them mock you for months when a single conversation might have changed everything?" Daniel's expression remained calm, though something almost sad passed briefly behind his eyes. "Explaining wouldn't have changed their minds," he said. "People believe what fits the story they've already decided to tell. The only thing that changes minds like that is proof, delivered at exactly the moment it matters most. Everything before that moment is simply noise." I thought of every mocking comment Lord Gareth Combe had directed toward him, every dismissive laugh from nobles who judged him purely on how quietly he carried himself, every doubt I myself had allowed to grow before finally beginning to see what had been standing beside me the entire time. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, the words feeling inadequate against months of doubt I had allowed myself to carry. "I judged you the same way everyone else did." Daniel shook his head slightly. "You listened. Eventually," he said. "That's more than most people ever manage." The shift within the court proved slower than I expected, though unmistakable once it began. Nobles who had once openly mocked my choice of guard now approached with careful, measured questions, curious whether other households might benefit from similar arrangements. whether more humans serving in positions of protection might offer advantages their own warriors, trained for centuries in more traditional methods, had somehow failed to develop. Boran Vask, to my genuine surprise, requested additional training sessions with Daniel, setting aside whatever pride had once fueled his earlier hostility in favor of a genuine desire to understand methods he now recognized as effective beyond anything his own training had prepared him for. Lord Gareth Combe remained quiet on the matter for several weeks, though I noticed a distinct change in how he addressed my household during subsequent gatherings, his usual confident mockery replaced by a careful, watchful caution that told me, more clearly than any words could, exactly how thoroughly his assumptions had been challenged. I received a private message from my father not long after, a rare and brief communication that carried more warmth than his usual formal correspondence typically allowed. He mentioned only that he had heard reports from Calyx Reach, and that he was pleased, though unsurprised, by how thoroughly my initial doubts had eventually resolved themselves. I understood then, reading his careful words, that he had known far more about Daniel's true nature from the very beginning than he had ever chosen to share with me directly, testing my own judgment as much as testing Daniel's ability, allowing me to reach my own understanding rather than simply telling me what to believe. The trade networks continued circulating quiet rumors about the failed contract for weeks afterward, speculation growing increasingly elaborate as facts remained scarce and the Kestrel Circle themselves offered no public explanation for their unprecedented retreat. Some speculated that Daniel represented some rare, specially trained human operative, perhaps connected to organizations most species knew little about. Others suggested more cautious theories, that humanity as a species carried hidden depths that the wider galaxy had simply never bothered to properly investigate, distracted instead by easy assumptions built on short lifespans and unremarkable physical strength. I found myself, in quiet moments during those following weeks, reconsidering everything I thought I understood about my own culture's definition of strength. We had built our entire society around displays, around warriors who announced their power constantly through size and volume and elaborate demonstrations of dominance. It had never occurred to any of us, myself included, that true capability might exist entirely without ceremony, that the quietest presence in any room might represent the greatest danger to anyone foolish enough to underestimate it. Nearly a month after the summit, during a quiet evening in my private chambers, I found myself asking Daniel one final question that had lingered in my mind since the night of the attack. "The assassins who retreated," I said, "do you think they'll return, now that they've seen what you're capable of?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "Professionals like that rarely return once a contract fails this decisively," he said. "Their entire reputation depends on avoiding unnecessary risk. Attacking again, now that they understand what they're facing, would cost them far more than any potential reward could offset. My guess is they've already moved on to contracts with better odds of success." "And what about you?" I asked. "Now that they know your face, now that word will likely spread through every trade network watching this station. Doesn't that put you at greater risk moving forward?" Daniel offered the faintest hint of something that might have been a smile, the first genuine expression of amusement I had seen from him since we first met on that docking platform months earlier. "That's their problem now," he said simply, before turning his attention back toward the quiet evening routine that had, over these many months, become as familiar to me as my own household's oldest traditions. I laughed, softly, surprised by how easily the sound came after everything we had endured together. Somewhere beyond the station's viewport, the distant stars continued their slow, silent movement across the darkness of space, indifferent to the small, quiet victory that had unfolded within these walls. A victory built not on strength loudly displayed, but on patience, discipline, and a kind of quiet capability that an entire galaxy of warriors, trained from childhood to value spectacle above all else, had simply never learned to recognize until it was standing right in front of them. Word of what happened at Calyx Reach spread slowly across the wider trade networks in the months that followed, carried not through official reports, since the Kestrel Circle's failure remained too embarrassing for most parties involved to discuss openly, but through the quieter channels of rumor and careful observation that traveled fastest among cultures built on reputation and fear. Other noble houses, cautious at first, began making discreet inquiries about human guards, about training traditions most species had dismissed for generations as unremarkable compared to their own warrior cultures. I do not know whether the wider galaxy will ever fully understand what I came to understand during those difficult months on Calyx Reach. I do not know whether humanity's quiet reputation will continue shifting from something to be pitied into something approached with genuine caution, or whether old assumptions will simply reassert themselves once memory of this particular incident fades into another forgotten footnote among countless border conflicts. What I know, standing now in a position of leadership I once approached with far more doubt than confidence, is this: I judge Daniel Hart by every standard my culture had ever taught me to value, and I was wrong about nearly everything that mattered. Strength, I have come to understand, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it stands quietly in the corner of a room, overlooked and underestimated, waiting patiently for the exact moment when quiet capability matters more than any loud display ever could. And somewhere across the vast, indifferent expanse of the galaxy, I suspect there are others like him, humans serving quietly in positions few bother to respect, carrying within them the same patient, unglamorous strength that once allowed an entire fragile species to survive against odds far greater than anything most of us have ever truly faced. I only hope, for the sake of whoever underestimates them next, that they learn the lesson faster than I did.
I hope you're good. I wonder what you can do for your trachea. Is that how you say it? Trachea? I wonder what can be done about it. Alright, I'm not seeing the thing I need. Yeah, I wonder how you can, I guess just not using it as much. Yesterday was your birthday? Feeling good? Happy birthday for yesterday. Did you get some nice gifts? Oh, maybe. I need a... Oh, this looks like another little village, so we'll go over there. There might be something there. You take meds. Use a remedy. Okay. Have some honey. Soothe your throat. That's good. Okay, node manager. What do you think you're doing? With that fire inside the building. Crazy, crazy man. Music's cool. Okay, this is just a farm.
Have you come all the way here to make contract with me?
What?
Others call me the man of luck. I'm not lying.
Okay. Okay.
You an adventurer? Well, I'm busy right now, so if it's about work, leave it for later.
Hi, Darth Elwood. How are you? Welcome in. Oh. Oh no. What happened to your horse? I need to sell my fish. Maybe I can't. Okay, this must be where the desert is. Do you reckon that's a town? Doesn't look like a town. Cannot set destination in the desert. What? Oh. Okay. Well, hopefully I don't die.